Blocking in TCGs has been around since Magic the Gathering. It allows the defending player to decide whether pieces are important enough to try to save as much as possible, or if it's okay to go ahead and sacrifice them to try to make it to the next turn. Defending can show up in many different ways, either from hand, from field, or some combination of both. And some ways of implementing defensive mechanics are better than others. It is my opinion that giving cards skills like blocker rather than having blocking as a universal game mechanic actually hurts card design, game design, and might even shorten the longevity of the game's life in the West specifically. Here are my 4 reasons why I think that blocker is a bad idea for game design. Any card effect that changes the way the game is played has to be considered and balanced alongside other card effects. Whenever you're designing a card game, you have to decide the costs of a skill, the things that skill does, and when that skill triggers, and how strong the units are that you put that skill on. In Magic the Gathering, you have to balance the power, the toughness, and the skills of different creatures. You have to balance how much mana that creature might cost to put it on the board. And not only that, you have to consider it from an offensive perspective and a defensive perspective, because that creature can be an attacker and can be a blocker. Now, certain creatures will be designed with different purposes in mind, where you have walls in Magic the Gathering where they have 0 power usually and some high amount of toughness, and that keeps them on the field as blockers. But in Magic the Gathering, these skills are easier to balance because you know that every creature you design, whether you intend them for offense or intend them for defense, you know that every creature you design can block. And so blocking isn't something you have to necessarily take into consideration whenever you're designing the card itself. Giving it blocker isn't anything extra on top of the other skills it has. Every creature can block, so every creature can be considered as if it has blocker, rather than giving it blocker and then trying to go, oh no, we've given it a new skill that it can defend. Now I have to try to balance that with its other skills if we give it other skills. So having blocker as a card skill and not as a universal game mechanic really limits card design, because you are constantly having to balance against giving any card any defensive capabilities whatsoever. Giving a card blocker means that I have to try to balance now blocker and what strength this creature has, what power it has, what other skills it has. I have to decide that those other skills are balanced with the fact that it has blocker, and some other creature with its costs and its skills and its power and defense are also balanced with this other creature that have blocker. For instance, in Digimon, you have to consider every time you give a Digimon blocker the fact that it has that skill. Whereas in Magic, you don't have to consider blocker on any particular creature because all creatures can block. And so in Magic, I don't have to balance this goblin with this wall. Instead, I've designed the wall for defensive purposes and it can block. I've designed this goblin for offensive purposes, but it can block. In Digimon, when you give a Digimon blocker, what you've done is inherently given this card a specific skill that helps the opponent survive. And now you have to question, how strong is blocker compared to other skills we will give to other cards that will have similar costs and have similar value, without making either one way too strong to where they're going to be leaned into heavily, although we know how the TCG community loves to take advantage of imbalanced cards. So in balancing the game, using blocker becomes more difficult, since a defender can never become too offensive because it's been given blocker, and you don't want to give it anything offensive since no other card has that defensive skill if it doesn't have blocker, or else the card becomes imbalanced and way too versatile for card games that have this separated offensive card and defensive card categories. Number 2, granting every card the same defensive power forces the player to make crucial in-game choices. So deck building is a fun part of every single TCG. I love deck building, I love theory crafting, I love coming up with weird things that no one really thought of, and I love seeing the versatility in a lot of decks that end up topping in a game like Vanguard or whatever, in the sense that when you have something that can get a little more toolboxy or play a bunch of different other cards, then you get to see some interesting choices and you can see a little bit of the play style of the player coming through. However, I do think that in-game choices should matter quite a lot, because it's not only how do you build your deck, what cards do you have available to you, it's also how do you play that deck and how is it that you want to pull off your win condition. I think having blocking as a card effect means that I have to choose to take something out of my deck that's offensive and stick a blocker in there to try to survive. This means that the choice moves from in-game to deck building purely, because I have to design my entire strategy around getting my win condition off. In every TCG, you will be designing your deck around your win condition. Don't think I'm saying that the blocker just creates this situation. However, I will say that it forces you to choose to be less aggressive overall, no matter what your matchup is, no matter how you need to play it in the moment. You are not allowed to be as versatile in your playing as you are if everything has blocker, because everything has blocker. I don't have to put blockers in my deck and move that choice to deck building. Instead, I get to choose in game, okay, this piece is really important for my offensive strategy. However, I've got to survive this turn, so I'm just going to block with it, sacrifice it, and hope that I can make it in the end. And so I think that moves the choice of defense versus offense to the deck building aspect of the game if you put blocker in the game, rather than allowing all cards to block, which allows those in-game choices to matter much more, because there are certain cards, certain creatures, certain units that when lost can really hurt your win condition, but sometimes you got to lose them to survive. So I think it makes for a much more exciting in-game play experience, even if it does lead to a less strategic deck building experience. When TCGs add the card ability blocker into their games, it forces the choices to be made before the game even happens. If you are playing a more defensive deck against a more aggressive deck that you need to respond offensively or aggressively to, you can't do that. You play a defensive deck. You've got too many blockers in there. In Digimon, they punish you for being aggressive with your blockers, and I think that that really harms the versatility of any deck in a game. Games without blocker as an ability do not have a hard choice between being defensive and offensive. For instance, in Vanguard, right now, the top deck is a slower deck called Vanguard. It wins about the second grade 3 turn most of the time, but can kind of dawdle a little bit and turtle itself up and survive for longer. However, if I go against a deck that is faster than Luard, I can always hope that I draw some good pieces to drop hand and rush them down if I need to. This can't really happen if you've built a defensive deck in a game where blocker is present, because blocking units have been scaled back because they're defensive in their offensive capabilities. But if blocking is a universal game mechanic, then all I have to do in order to balance the cards and in order to scale those blockers is go, well, everything can block, so it's not something to remove offensive capability for. It's just something to consider whether I'm going to make this unit more prone for offensive plays or defensive plays, but they can usually be used for either or both. My third reason I prefer universal guard mechanics is because universal game mechanics open up deck building. They don't limit it. So whenever you create these decks that are more prone to play slower, you're going to force me to play lots of blockers because I have to survive to play that slower game. However, if the meta is really fast, then I have to play all these super fast cards, and I can't play any blockers because I have to hit my opponent before they hit me. And I think that having a healthy way of utilizing defensive mechanics within the game itself and universally allows for decks to become more offensive and aggressive, but also be able to at least have the chance to survive against aggressive decks, and allows slower decks to also have a good chance to survive against aggressive decks by being able to try to keep up with the tempo between itself and the more aggressive deck. Having blocker as a mechanic just means, okay, I've chosen from the beginning that my deck's going to be defensive, and it's going to constantly be a TCG of meta calls rather than being a TCG of, well, I chose this deck because I think it's a great deck, but I also made some good choices in game that allowed me to win. The fourth reason I really don't like blocker as a card mechanic is because I believe that it's better to have wider open game mechanics and to remove them with skills than it is to have more narrow game mechanics and add them in with card skills. In Vanguard, there are a lot of things that remove your ability to guard or remove your ability to guard with certain cards. And I think that that is a cool choice because no matter what, I can guard against things, but if they have a skill that shuts off my guarding, now I have to think strategically about my defense. If I have a skill that allows me to guard from a different place, like Gurgit can guard from the deck, then I all of a sudden have a counterplay to their counterplay of guarding. And so I really like the fact that wider open game mechanics and taking them away with card skills allows you to kind of counterplay and counterplay and counterplay. Whereas if you are extremely narrow in your universal game mechanics and add them on with card skills, well, then we constantly, from here on out, if you decide to make blocker a universal mechanic, unless you just change the fundamental rules of your game, you have to print blocker on all these different cards that you're printing out, and then we just have text showing up, and you're trying to add a mechanic that should be universal to just every card. And what's the point? Just give it a universal mechanic rather than trying to add this thing to every card. In my opinion as well, while we have wider open game mechanics, it's easier to chisel away at your opponent's options or the player's options than it is to try to open it back up unless you fundamentally change the way the game is played. And I think that being able to chisel away at the opponent or the player's options is a more interesting way to introduce a strategy behind the gameplay and not force the player to have to choose before the game even starts how they're going to have to play the game. Again, in Vanguard, you have different skills that restrict the guarding of your opponent. It feels, whenever someone uses guard restrict in Vanguard, like my opponent is making the call to restrict my ability to guard, rather than the game itself deciding I'm just not going to be able to defend because I don't have a blocker on the field, or I don't have that option card that will hopefully come out that's like an instant that does something to stop me from being attacked. There are a lot of issues, I think, for a player who feels kind of helpless in that situation because there's no defensive options to play against an aggressive deck, or even to play against any deck. For instance, I think this is one reason why Omnimon is so strong. It's really hard to be able to survive a huge card that destroys possibly multiple Digimon and then not have anything defensive to answer back, because if he pops your blocker, well, you can't defend yourself. That's it. He just has to hope you don't flip a Terraforce. And so I think that that's really the big problem there for the blocker mechanic. I think that blocking as a card skill causes more cards to become unbalanced, because if you just pick off the blocker, then you just win. It makes the card games much faster, they are over much faster, and you don't really feel satisfied playing the game because you've only played 5 minutes, your opponent's got an Omnimon on the board, blown up your blocker, and now you're dead because he swings for like 4 security at a time. So I think that blocker is a very bad idea for card design, especially as a card skill, but universal game mechanics of defense are the way to go. I love the way that Magic does it. I love the way that Vanguard does it. I love the way that Weiss does it, even with reducing the amount of soul or damage that your opponent does to you if you have a card in front of their card. I think that things like that provide a little bit more strategy without having to inherently design cards for defense or inherently design cards for offense, but allows you to have to sacrifice an offensive card in order to have a turn, makes it for really interesting gameplay rather than forcing all the decisions to be made beforehand. So these are my 4 reasons for not really liking blocker as a card ability and preferring universal guard mechanics. I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a comment down below on your opinion of what blocker has done well. I know Duel Masters and Kaijudo and Digimon and Chrono Clash have all had them. I don't know what other games might have had them, so comment those down below as well. I really enjoyed making this video. I think that talking about different aspects of game design is really interesting, so let me know if you think that I should tackle any other specific topics of card game design. Thanks for all the support. Let me know what games you want to cover or anything like that. I'm going to be doing a whole bunch of these kinds of videos and covering some Vanguard deck builds, and once the Digimon card game comes out, because we're about 2 weeks away from us getting our pre-release stuff, I'll be doing some content based around the Digimon game as well. I really appreciate you guys clicking on the video and checking it out, and I'll see you guys next time.